Okay, we're going to call the Chino City Council and the success. I have to wait till we start rolling, huh? Okay. We're going to call the Chino City Council and the Successor Agency to the Redevelopment Agency to order for our workshop. It's January 17th, Tuesday at 4:30 p.m. I'm going to ask, almost said officer, Councilperson Burton to lead us in the flag salute. Oops.
Would you all stand, please? Ready to begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Old habits die hard. Okay, if the city clerk will please note that all council members are present. Under public communication, now is the time and the place for the general public to address the council on any item that is not on the agenda. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to address the council on any item on the workshop agenda or that is not on the workshop agenda? Okay, seeing none, we will move on then to item number 1 under discussion, implementation of the 2021-29 housing element, zoning ordinance amendments, and inclusionary requirement for affordable housing. This is the implementation of the 21-29 housing element and some modifications that are being made to it. I'd like to ask for a staff report from Nick Liguori, who is Director of Development Services. Nick?
Thank you, Mayor and council members. I would like to introduce our consultant team who's been working on this. Andrew Hill with Diet and Bhatia, who's also our general plan update consultant, is here to speak about the zoning overlays for the mixed use. It's the implementation of the sites that were approved under Measure Y earlier in the year, and a primary implementation item of our housing element update. And one of the advantages of our consultant putting this together is that it will mesh well with the revised zoning code that will come into play when we have the general plan update completed. So I'm going to hand the presentation over to Andrew.
Great, thank you, Nick, and good evening, council members. So as Nick said, over the past several months, staff and the consultant team have been working to develop zoning amendments to implement the housing element, and this includes a mixed-use overlay and an affordable housing overlay. In my presentation tonight, I'd like to provide an overview of the work that we've completed to date, including a review of the background and purpose for the zoning amendments, as well as an overview of the key content proposed for the overlays. And additionally, I'll highlight several policy questions that we would like the council to weigh in on as we work to finalize the draft zoning amendments and bring them forward to you later this spring for consideration for adoption. So let me start off with a little bit of background. As you are probably aware, the housing element proposed creation of 2 overlays as a strategy for meeting Chino's RHNA obligations for lower income housing. And those are a mixed use overlay and an affordable housing overlay. Both overlays would allow for residential development at up to 30 dwelling units per acre on certain specific properties as shown on the map at right here. Most of these properties are non-residentially zoned today, and so a vote of the people is required to allow for housing development on them consistent with Measure M. Chino voters authorized the creation of these 2 overlays last June with the passage of Measure Y. The state is also requiring the adoption of the overlays before they will certify the housing element. So we've been fast tracking this work as needed to implement the housing element. The zoning amendments that I'm talking about actually that are needed to implement the housing element have 3 main items. The first of them is the preparation of the mixed use and affordable housing overlay, including related development standards. But there are also revisions to the citywide parking standards and a financial feasibility analysis to assess whether inclusionary housing requirements will make economic sense for developers in our local real estate market. So all of these three topics are interrelated, and I'll be touching on all of them in my presentation this evening. Before I get into the details of the amendments, I thought it would be helpful to provide a little bit of background on the zoning ordinance. So the zoning ordinance is, of course, the primary tool for implementing the general plan. It translates broad land use policies into parcel-specific requirements, and it can be used in a variety of different ways. For example, to minimize nuisances and environmental harms, to support the city's economic development initiatives, and of course, to promote affordable housing as needed in the community. So the zoning ordinance includes both base districts and overlays. Base districts are use-based, and they align with the general plan land use designations. And so they establish areas where residential, commercial, industrial, or a mixed-use development is desired. And then in each of those zoning districts, the zoning ordinance establishes standards that control residential density or building intensity, building heights, building placement on the lot, and locations for parking. Overlays are used to modify the base zoning for a specific purpose. So for example, an overlay might establish additional requirements in areas of environmental hazard, or it might allow for additional uses in suitable locations, or it might allow for additional density or building height under certain conditions. Chino's zoning ordinance already has several overlays, including overlays for agricultural areas, or an overlay for land around the airport, and an overlay for the downtown area. The mixed-use overlay and the affordable housing overlay would allow for housing development in certain areas shown on that previous map to help the city meet its RHNA requirements. And so, again, our purpose tonight, our objectives for this workshop today are to provide the council with an update on the status of the work, to present some different options for the structure and content of the overlays, and to receive your feedback so that we can roll that in to a full draft that'll come back to the council for consideration later in the spring. So there are 5 specific policy questions that we'd like to get your input on tonight. They all relate to the structure and the content of the overlays. And so what I'd like to do is go through them one by one. The first of these 5 policy questions has to do with the regulatory structure of the overlays. We're proposing that the overlays would be voluntary, meaning that the property owners would have options. The owners could still develop their existing properties with retail and office uses as allowed under the base zoning, or they could make renovations and upgrades consistent with the base zoning if they choose. However, the overlays would give them an additional option, and they would be structured with regulatory and process incentives, in order to reduce costs and make it more attractive to develop with affordable housing that can help the city meet its RHNA obligations. So this approach to structuring the overlays has been used in communities throughout California. In fact, we surveyed about 85 different communities and documented their compliance requirements in a matrix that's been included in your packet. And we're using that to help ensure that the Chino's overlays requirements and standards are consistent with peer communities. Flexibility is a real watchword, for our proposed approach to these overlays. In the mixed-use overlay, for example, we would not require a minimum non-residential square footage, but the standards would require a pedestrian orientation to the new development to help integrate the housing and commercial uses. And particularly with rising mortgage costs and lending costs these days, building flexibility into the standards is really critical for helping to generate housing that can help Chino meet its RHNA obligations. The second policy question has to do with density.
Excuse me, can you
Yes.
go back to that?
Yes.
You talk in broad language. What kind of flexibility are you talking about?
Yeah, so I think as I go through the presentation, I'll touch on a number of ways we're building in that flexibility. For example, under this, I'm going to come to this in a moment, but to give you a preview, under the state density bonus program, it's sort of 30 dwelling units per acre. But what we're proposing, and I'm going to get to this in a moment in more detail, is a sliding scale that would allow for projects at lower densities or up to, and that would receive increasing up to 30 dwelling units per acre in exchange for more affordability. So we're, rather than a one-size-fits-all solution, we're proposing a sliding scale to give flexibility. So that's one example of how to build in flexibility. Another example is what I was trying to get at here with the mixed-use overlay. Rather than saying a certain percentage or a certain square footage must be non-residential on a given site, we would leave that up to the market to decide what the appropriate percentage of retail and or non-residential and residential would be. However, the standards would be engineered to promote walkability so as to better integrate the residential and non-residential uses.
Okay, there's always fancy terminology that's used to kind of avoid maybe controversial, obvious issues. Now, when you say walkability, does that tie to less parking available to force people out of their cars?
Not necessarily. I think it has to do with where the location of the parking.
The location of the parking. So make them park farther away so that they walk to their units and walk to the commercial?
I think it means that the consideration of the building location would be given not only to the people who are driving to shop on the site, but also to the people living on the site who might need to walk through the site. So rather than planning first for where the retail shoppers are going to park, it's thinking about how to. It's thinking about the people who live on the site, how they're going to be using the site, and making sure that their considerations are planned for as well. So that it's about the location of the parking more than the amount of parking.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, please do interrupt with questions if you have them. There's a lot of information, so if it's helpful to stop me, please.
Well, and being a workshop, I know we're going to have some public watching this, and so terminology that's common to you and some of it that's common to us is not going to be common to the general public. So I want to make sure they really understand what
Yeah.
we're talking about tonight.
Yeah, good point. So anyway, please stop me with questions. So the second policy question has to do with density. The overlays would create value for property owners by allowing for increased density. And the financial analysis has confirmed that this will incentivize redevelopment with affordable housing that can help to meet RHNA obligations. We're proposing to structure the overlays with a sliding scale that establishes a minimum affordability requirement, but allows more density in exchange for more affordable units, up to a maximum of 30 dwelling units per acre. So, for example, a rental project offering 10% of its units affordable to lower income households could build at 20 dwelling units per acre under the approach that we're proposing. However, if the applicant wants to build at 30 dwelling units per acre, they would need to make 35% of the units available to lower income households. So what they're getting is more units or rather what the community is getting, more affordable units in exchange for more density. This is what the sliding scale would offer. And it has, the sliding scale is really a powerful tool for incentivizing affordable housing that has proven successful in communities throughout California. It offers flexibility to help projects pencil out in terms of financial feasibility, rather than imposing a one-size-fits-all requirement. The state density bonus route would still be available for qualifying projects. However, the financial analysis indicates that the state program doesn't enhance opportunities for redevelopment of commercial sites substantially because of the labor cost involved, because of the prevailing wage requirements required under the state density program, and because of requirements to produce pro forma documentation in order to justify any requests for concessions or incentives. So this means that the sliding scale option that we're proposing would likely be more attractive to developers in most cases. The third policy question has to do with modifications to development standards intended to incentivize use of the overlays. We're proposing to base the overlay standards on Chino's existing RD20 and mixed-use standards, but with some modifications to accommodate increased density and help with financial feasibility. Specifically, the modifications that we're looking at would reduce setbacks and open space requirements over current standards, would eliminate requirements for on-site amenities for sites that are close to existing parks, and would modify parking standards. So the proposed modifications are all comparable with the California jurisdictions that we surveyed, and would be consistent with best practices. For example, in terms of the setback modifications, we're proposing that no side setbacks would be required for ground floor commercial development in the mixed-use overlay. And in terms of open space, the city's current requirement is for 200 square feet of open space for ground floor multifamily units. That would be reduced to 100 square feet, and the city's current standards require 100 square feet of open space for upper story units. That would be reduced to 60 square feet. This has the advantage of providing cost savings for the developers and incentivizing the use of the overlays. In terms of recreational facilities, there's a current requirement for the provision of on-site recreational facilities in multifamily development. That would be waived for sites that are within half mile of an existing park. Again, the intention is to reduce costs for developers in order to incentivize the use of the overlays. And then parking, the modifications here would eliminate the covered parking requirement for projects with densities of 20 dwelling units per acre or more, and they would reduce the requirement and require only one covered parking spot for projects proposing 16 to 19 dwelling units per acre. Again, the intention here is to provide cost savings. The requirement in all cases would be that the uncovered parking would need to be relocated at the rear of the lot and screened from public view. And then additionally, the parking modifications proposed would be to reduce the parking requirements for affordable projects in line with the requirements of state law. The fourth policy question that we wanted to get your feedback on has to do with in lieu options. Some communities in California offer an in lieu option to provide flexibility that helps with project feasibility. And we're proposing two in lieu options here. The first of these is an in lieu fee payment. So this would apply for small projects, for example, 20 units or less, where affordable housing on-site might not be feasible. And so in that case, the project proponents could pay a fee instead that could be used, go into a fund and be used to fund future affordable housing. Additionally, the proposal that we're working on now might allow larger projects also to pay an in lieu fee. But that option would be subject to council approval. So the second option, in lieu option, would be land dedication in lieu of construction. In this case, the property owner could transfer a portion of an overlay site equal in value to the in lieu fee to an experienced affordable housing developer for them to construct. And this approach offers several benefits. It allows for developers with experience in building affordable projects to do the construction. And it also increases eligibility for a variety of different state funds. So those would be the benefits there. The fifth policy question has to do with the development review process. The proposal that we're working on now, under that, the overlays would allow housing by right, subject to objective design and development standards. This would streamline the permit approval process over what is currently required for projects seeking a density bonus under the city's density bonus program. This would shorten the approval timeframe and provide more certainty for developers, while also avoiding the need for case-by-case negotiations. However, amendments would still allow for a checklist-style design review by the Planning Commission using the city's site approval process. Under state law, a conditional use permit and a hearing requirement cannot be imposed on an affordable housing project. But the approach that we're proposing would still allow for the Planning Commission to be involved in the review process. So the staff report and this presentation have included a lot of detail on the proposed content and structure of the amendments needed to implement the housing element. As we work on a full draft of the ordinance for your consideration later this spring, we wanted to get some advance input for you on some specific topics to confirm that we're on the right path. And I've put the questions out here for you, and we're hoping that your comments can address these topics to confirm that we're on the right path. The first of them really has to do with the regulatory structure, as I talked about. Do you agree that the overlays should be voluntary and structured with incentives if affordable housing is proposed? The second topic has to do with density. Do you believe that, do you support structuring the overlays with a maximum base density with allowances for additional density with affordable housing up to 30 dwelling units per acre, the limit set in the general plan? Development incentives, should the development incentives for affordable housing in the overlay districts include reduced setbacks, reduced open space requirements, reduced parking, and relief from covered parking requirements? And the in lieu fee option. Should an in lieu fee option be included in the inclusionary housing program? And if so, should it be only for small projects or available for all projects? And then finally, with respect to the development review process, should the Planning Commission be the decision maker responsible for site approval for affordable housing and mixed use projects in the overlay districts with staff level review and ministerial approvals only when required by state law for certain qualifying projects? And then just closing, I wanted to give you an overview of the next steps in the process. With your input tonight, we'll take on board your feedback and work to finalize the overlay zoning and the overlay zoning work and the inclusionary study that would be ready by the beginning of February. The full draft of the zoning amendments would go to the Planning Commission for a formal hearing on February 22nd, and then to City Council on March 21st. With that, I'll pause for comments or questions.
Okay, first, could you put it back on the questions? And then before we start with council discussion, because I think there's going to be quite a bit, I'd like to ask if there's anyone in the audience that would like to address the council on this item before we begin our discussion. Okay, seeing none, then we'll turn it over to council. Let's handle it question by question. So number one, regulatory structure. Should inclusionary housing in the overlay districts be a voluntary program offering development incentives if affordable housing is proposed as allowed by Measure Y? Did we have any state comments on this item?
No, we did not. In general, the state allows an overlay structure. So they do allow a property owner to voluntarily choose to either build the housing or build what's in the underlying zoning. And the way that we justified that with the state is that the sites that were identified in the housing element more than meet the RHNA. So if the RHNA is at 100%, almost 7,000 units, we identified sites that could accommodate almost 150%. It's like 145 or something like that. So because we identified additional, there's margin for those property owners that don't elect to use the overlay, and we could still justify our RHNA to the state. So the state does allow for the voluntary nature of the overlay program.
Okay, so this was an idea proposed by staff, not the state.
Correct.
Okay. Council comments on regulatory structure? None? No comments? Okay. Then we'll move on to number two, density. Should the overlay districts be structured with a maximum base density with allowances for additional density with additional affordable housing up to 30 units per acre, the limit set in the general plan? Now, I'm confused when you say with a maximum base density. The maximum base density is 30, right? Isn't that what was in the mixed, or the overlays?
So the structure that we would be proposing would be 20 units per acre would be the maximum base. But if the builder builds additional affordable units, they could go up to 30. And this is based on really some of the comments that we heard from the council when we were going through the housing element workshops, where the council is concerned about the developer getting the density, but not necessarily providing the benefit of affordability. And so this incentive here will guarantee that more affordable units will be attained by the city in exchange for them being able to build up to the 30 units per acre.
Okay, but Nick, I thought when we went through this that the state was mandating a density of 30 per acre.
So the 30 per acre is our default density. So to meet our RHNA, the state would not consider any site zoned less than 30 units per acre to be available to be available to low and very low income residents for purposes of the RHNA. Because the overlay has a requirement that units are built for low and very low, it's consistent with state law because we have the 30 units per acre available, but it also is an incentive for the city to get actually more affordable units, because per the RHNA, we can zone the site 30 units per acre, but the developer could build all market rate at 30 units per acre. The city would not attain the affordable units, but we'd still be in compliance with state law. So this is a way of achieving both objectives.
So if there is an overlay that says 20 per acre and the developer chooses to do that but not use any affordable units in the 20 per acre on the overlay, none of that will count toward the RENA numbers.
It won't count toward the lower income RENA numbers, but it'll count, for moderate or above moderate. I think a way to just layer on to what Nick was saying that might be helpful is when you're drafting the housing element prior to certification, you're projecting forward. And in cases of projections, the state wants to see that that there's that 30 dwelling units per acre. Now what we're thinking about is implementation, so the actual units getting built. And in that case, it doesn't matter what the density is, as long as the units are perhaps deed restricted or made affordable to lower income houses. So when you're thinking about implementation, it doesn't matter whether it's 20 or 30. It matters whether they're deed restricted to be available to lower income households.
But if none of them are deed restricted, then it doesn't count toward RENA.
That's right. However, the way with the sliding scale, with the reduced, standards or the modified standards that are trying to incentivize the use of the overlays, we think we're going to get more affordable units. And again, the sliding scale that would allow somebody to build an affordable project at 20 dwelling units per acre or up 25 or up to 30 dwelling units per acre, we think is going to increase the possibility that projects are going to pencil out financially. And this has been the experience of other communities across California that have used, a more flexible approach like this, that they have seen the affordable housing built.
Yes, Fred.
If I may, Mayor and Council, so the RENA numbers, it's good to understand that when we're mandated to build 7,000 units or accommodate for 7,000 units, as was mentioned, that doesn't mean that they all have to be affordable, but we have to take actions to assure that we accommodate for a likelihood that a portion of those will be affordable. And the way you accommodate for that is higher density, reduced standards, increase in density if they do provide and commit through a covenant to have some affordable units. But you have some RENA numbers that have nothing to do with the affordability requirements. It's the 7,000 units is the total number.
Refresh my memory. The 7,000 was the total number. How many were low and moderate income?
We had roughly 50%.
So 3,500 has to be low
Yeah,
and
it's a
moderate.
little bit under 3,500.
And I also wanted to go back and clarify one point that I made. And I'm showing this slide again because at 20 dwelling units per acre, there would still be a 10% inclusionary requirement.
Mandatory.
Mandatory. So 10% of the units at 20% would be affordable for lower income rental housing projects in this case. If the developer wanted to build at 30 dwelling units per acre, then the percentage of affordable units would increase to 35%. So this is where we get into this trade-off that I was mentioning. If the developer wants more density, they need to give the community more affordable units. That's the structure of this sliding scale.
Okay. Council comments or questions on this item? Okay. Question number 3. Development incentives. Should the development incentives for affordable housing in the overlay districts include reduced setbacks, reduced open space requirements, reduced parking, and relief from covered parking requirements? I have a real heartburn on this. As you know, I'm not happy with our parking requirements as it is because it's impacting neighboring development, it's impacting neighbors. I know the forward-thinking planners think that in another 20 years we won't be driving cars at all. I find that ridiculous. To me, we are forcing low and moderate income dwellers into high-density areas, packed in, and now we're talking about reduced open space, reduced recreation, anywhere for them to go if they're within a half a mile of a park. A family with kids needs open space to keep their sanity. Kids need places to go to ride bikes and not to have to go a half a mile. So I think these requirements to me are actually victimizing low and moderate income families. That's my feeling on this, because you're jamming people in and not even giving them quality living space. So personally, I have a lot of heartburn with these incentives.
I would agree with you, Mayor. We have a major issue already in the city in certain areas. And to reduce the parking and the open space requirements in these areas that we're talking about putting high density, I think we're going to shoot ourselves in the foot. And I don't agree with that at all.
You know, I can understand giving relief from open space requirements if the development literally is right next door to a park. I can understand that because you're right there anyway. But looking at an infill project that's not near anywhere where kids can go, and we have those already. We have some apartment complexes that are like that. And the kids have nowhere to go, and their parents aren't going to say, go ride your bike for a half hour before dinner. Not if they have to go a half a mile to find a place to go ride a bicycle or play outside.
What I can offer in response to that is that these are proposals, and this is exactly why we're here. We want to get feedback so that we can refine this and bring something back to a full draft of the ordinance back to you that's more in line with your expectations. So, and I think I also see your point, particularly because so many of these sites are located in the northern part of the city where there's already challenges around the amount of parkland, and so that is something that we could look to remove. With respect to the parking, I would, it's a little bit of a nuance, but a point to make is that the city would not be requiring a certain amount of parking be built. However, that doesn't mean it wouldn't get built because of market considerations. If lenders require a certain amount of parking, if the market demands a certain amount of parking, it will get built. The idea would be to not that the city wouldn't be deciding how much parking gets built, but rather that the market would decide.
Well, Andrew, I have to disagree with that.
Okay.
Because we have a lot of development right now that's fairly new. The developers argue vehemently that they don't want to provide parking. In fact, one of the biggest developers is arguing about no parking at all because he's one of the proponents of no cars at all in the next 15, 20 years. So looking forward, he doesn't even want to provide any parking. So what are we left with? We're left with beautiful developments like in the Preserve and in College Park where you have neighbors literally fighting over on-street parking because there isn't anywhere to go. So let the developers decide, let the market decide is a little bit of a fallacy because they're going to do as less as they can so they can build more units so that their bottom line looks better. So if we don't impose it, it isn't going to happen. That's my personal opinion from what I've observed for a long time. Council, I'll get off my soapbox. Karen?
Mayor, I agree with your statements. I actually wrote down some questions for staff that I'd like to just ask after these are done, and then comment on some of these questions because I'm listening and gaining more just more thoughts about each of these as we go along. But
Okay.
the parking issue is and some of these setbacks and different things. We're already experiencing that in different locations. So I'll save my comments till we're done with these 5 questions and then cover them all at once, if that's okay, Mayor.
Okay. Any other comments on number 3?
Yeah, I also want to piggyback off, though. One of the biggest problems that we're having is obviously parking. A lot of times, this affordable housing, they only want to, give 1 parking spot or maybe 2. And the reality that they have people with more than just 2 cars. And then you have to have available space for people to come visit. And by allowing them to, as an incentive, to not provide that and thinking that a developer is going to come in and say, hey, I'm going to be the best guy in the world and I'm going to give you additional parking, that's just, I've yet to see that happen in 4 years of being on the council where a developer comes in and says, I'll give you more than I'm required to give you. They either give you exactly what you condition them to do, or they'll try to do a little less. So I agree with the mayor. I think that's that's a unicorn that you're telling me is going to happen, and I don't see it happening. But yeah, some of these development incentives, I just can't see myself agreeing to, just because we already see the problems that we're having. And this city does not have a good public transit system, period. They just don't. And to start designing houses or apartment complexes with the anticipation of people not driving or getting around on public transportation, you know, first build it and then they will come. You know, not, you know, build that public transit system here before you start building the houses, because once the houses are here, I don't know if your public transit system is going to come. And that's why developments like in Almani, some of the downtown areas, they're flourishing because they're right around transit hubs, but we don't have any transit hubs here. The transit hub that we're supposed to have is the one right behind the city hall, and you can see it's not quite the transit hub that many cities have. So I agree with the mayor. I don't think that those development incentives should be in play.
Well, in addition to that, Mark, one of the things we did with the last preserve specific plan amendment was remove the transportation component down there with the restructuring of the streets, which was part of the reason I was opposed to some of the things that were in the amendment. So we talk about no cars, no public transportation. They do have to get in and out of that community somehow. So, I mean, no cars, no parking, pardon me. So,
Well, and sitting on the Omnitrans Board of Directors, Omnitrans doesn't even break even now with the fees that they charge for bus rides and access and all of that. They're heavily subsidized by SBCTA in the state and the federal government. There are no proposals on increasing bus lines in the city of Chino.
they're not unique, Mayor. I don't think the Metrolink or any of these other public
Metrolink
transportations
will
are.
never be down here.
Well, I mean, I don't believe they're profitable. They're talking about being subsidized in bus routes in Los Angeles and other transportation components as well.
We're not going to have a good mass transit system down here that will take people to Orange County and LA County to where most of the jobs are. We're never going to have it here. Fred, you want to say something?
Yeah, and it's to Councilmember Lucio's point. The state law that we are having to face is AB 2097 that basically says if you're within a half mile of a transit stop, cities can't require parking requirements. Now, that standard was probably lifted off of the type of cities you mentioned, you know, in a heavily urbanized area where there's a very active transportation system. So we're facing this law without the benefit of the state having to acknowledge that some jurisdictions don't have those robust parking or transit systems. So that's one law. The other law that just came into place is 2011, which says that if a housing developer can go into a commercial lot and put in housing and not require the normal level of parking that your ordinance would require, there's some catches. They'd have to pay prevailing wages, et cetera. But those are the two areas of law that you do have to comply with. The rest, I suspect there's some flexibility with what's being recommended by staff. So I know that there's the other part of the question that is still pending for your consideration, but.
I also wanted to follow up with a question because I think we heard loud and clear about the amount of parking, but the other proposal that here has to do with covered parking. So not changing the total amount of parking, but rather reducing the requirements for covered parking, which also can help with the costs for the developer and the financial feasibility of the projects. And so what we proposed right now in the working draft is to reduce, to eliminate the covered parking requirement for higher density projects over 20 dwelling units per acre and reduce it for projects with 16 to 19 dwelling units per acre, with the caveat that all of that uncovered parking would need to be behind the structures and screened from public view. So I wanted to specifically hear from council members if that sort of incentive, which I think could help with the financial feasibility of projects, but doesn't change the overall amount of parking required, would be something that you would consider.
You know, the interesting thing, Andrew, on that is what I've observed around is that they're using covered parking for solar panels to try to offset electrical costs. So without covered parking, you're not gonna have the rooftops to put the the solar panels on either. So I'm wondering, how all that's working in the current market also, because you see parking lots covered everywhere now with solar panels.
But I wouldn't be opposed to uncovered parking, as long as we have plenty of parking for everybody.
You would not be opposed
I
to.
would not be opposed to it.
And Mayor, let me just add, some of the proposals we've seen for solar is they would put up the structure and put the solar on top of it.
Where would they do that?
Like what they've done in the school districts, all of them.
In the parking lots.
Right, the covered wasn't there already, they put
They
the
created the
structure
cover.
and put it on top. So that might not even be a consideration, they might, if they wanted to do that, they could have a company come in and put the structure up and put the solar on top.
Which would provide cover anyway. Okay, any other comments on number 3?
I would just ask, is that sentiment that Councilmember Lucio explained about the covered parking, allowing uncovered parking, something that would be amenable to the council?
Input? Anybody object to eliminating covered parking?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind, provided we had the option of doing the solar panels later if that ever came up. That'd be a great addition to that.
Karen?
I think this one I'm amenable to as long as there's plenty of parking, but covered parking does improve the quality of people's lives, and especially those dense areas. It provides them, because they're not going to be parking like most of us, is closer to their homes. They have to walk further away to their structure, and during heat or during rain, it's just one of those things where I'd like to look out for how people live. But I would rather I'd rather hang on to the parking if we had to give or take or something. I want to make sure we have enough parking for people, because those are always complaints in our current areas.
Chris?
Yeah, I have a question. Does the state require solar on all new residential housing?
I believe the answer is it is required for single-family construction, and I believe there is a law in the works, if it's not already active, to require it on multifamily housing as well.
I'm seeing nods.
Yes.
Okay, so is there a minimum requirement when it comes to the solar? Is there like so much power has to be generated per square foot or something? I mean, if these buildings are tall and skinny, is there still incentive to provide solar panels?
So just like most of the rules in the state that we have to navigate through, it's not a easy black and white answer where I can say they need 6 or they need 8 or they need 4. But there are minimum standards, and it's kind of a whole menu or a recipe of how developers get where they need to be with different solar and the locations of the solar. But on average, it's probably 6 to maybe, depending on the size of the house, 10 panels that are required.
Okay. All right, thank you, Mike. Okay, we'll move on to number 4.
Mayor, before we move on to that one, so I think we're clear on the parking. So reduced parking is not really an option, but covered parking is, removing that. But I don't think we got a clear answer on the setbacks or the open space. I know we talked a little bit about open space, that it's not close enough to a park is not. So it sounds like the council is not in favor of the open space requirement being reduced either?
I'm personally not.
Okay, and that, I think that's what I heard, but I don't think we talked
Well,
about setbacks.
Karen wants to revisit
You'll
on some of
revisit that.
these.
And how about the setbacks?
Well, I'm sorry, on the open space, I did hear you, Mayor, saying if it's closer to,
If it's right next to a park, I
Right
mean,
next.
literally next to a park,
Okay.
or maybe a block
quarter?
away,
Or a
but
quarter mile instead of a half mile?
quarter mile is all the way around around a track. Are you gonna send your little one on a bike a quarter of a mile to go ride the bike? No.
Depends how old they are,
Well,
but yeah,
you know,
okay. I just want to make sure you have clear on that one?
we'll revisit some of these. What I wanna do is go through them all and then go back,
Okay.
okay? Number 4, in lieu fee option. Should an in lieu fee option be included in the inclusionary housing program? Should it be only for small projects or available for all projects? I have a question. When you talked about that, you said an in lieu fee that could be used later for affordable housing. So, like, explain that, I don't understand.
It would go into a fund, so that affordable housing fund would be established. And so, for example, smaller projects, less than 20 units, where it isn't financially feasible for them to provide on site, they would pay that in lieu fee into the fund. And other, if there's other projects that also pay an in lieu fee, that would go into the fund. And when the fund gets to a certain level where it's feasible to either for the city to use that money to build the housing, or the fund could also be used to support other affordable housing projects with a local match, for example. That's essentially the in lieu fee would go into a fund that could be used in a variety of different ways.
Okay,
And-
so let's
I'm
say
sorry.
that we have developers that want to build at 20 per acre and they don't want to be bothered with affordable, but they'll pay an in lieu fee that goes into a pot. So all the development that's happening, none of it meets RENA because no affordable units are being actually built, right? And we get down the road and we're coming up against our 7 years or 10 years, whatever it is, and we haven't built the number that we need. So we have this money that we can use to subsidize another developer, or we build something or partner with Bridge Housing or something to get a complete project supposedly built. It's affordable to meet our mandated numbers. Is that?
Yes, that would be, that could work, but that might be a reason for not allowing the larger projects to pay an in lieu fee. However, the advantage, if it's a smaller project where the project isn't going to pencil out, if you require them to build on site, then that project might not happen at all. So you don't get any housing out of it, not lower income housing, not above market. And so in the case of the smaller projects, it might make sense to have them pay a reasonable fee into a fund so that you get some housing out of it. But the sort of scenario that you played out might be a reason for not allowing for an in lieu fee option for larger projects.
Okay, we have land right now that we designated 30 per unit, or 30 per acre, at the last RENA round, okay? We can't downzone it, it has to stay 30 per acre. It has not developed because the developers claim they cannot afford to build anything on the property, okay? So I guess what I'm getting at is we offer an in lieu fee to help offset development that would provide affordable housing at a higher density. But what if we can't get to those numbers, just like right now? We haven't been able to build any 30 per acre. And you know the project that I'm referring to, Nick.
Yeah, those properties are greenfield, what we call greenfield development. So in the preserve, where there's no infrastructure currently to support it. So that makes the development much more expensive. We anticipate those costs will be less in the overlay zones because they're in already developed areas of the city where the infrastructure is there, or it needs just basic improvements to extend it. And so it takes that cost burden away. And so that's also why we're suggesting that the in lieu fee should probably only be for the small projects, because a larger project, we would want to see the units actually realized out of that. But if some of these infill sites are pretty small, and so if we wanted to have, let's say, something that was more context sensitive and say, really, if you built it at 20 units per acre, they would get maybe 10 units out of it because it's only a half acre lot. And we didn't want to see 15 or 16 units in 3 stories because it just wouldn't be sensitive to the context. And we could convince the developer to do that and to pay a fee in lieu. That's the kind of thing where we would want that. And then we put that into the housing fund so that we could utilize it to work with other partners and to build more permanent affordable housing in the city. But a project of 100 units is one that, from staff's point of view, we would like to see the inclusionary applied.
So if council supports only these small projects, it would do projects with 20 or less density units. Correct?
Total units, not the density, the number of units.
Yeah, total.
So smaller projects, yeah.
How would you balance that out, Andrew, as far as, you know, the affordable, the affordable units versus the others that are not in that same group? How do you balance that?
I think I don't have the numbers at my fingertips right now, but looking at the size of those sites that you've identified and that the voters approved for inclusion in the overlays, they're relatively large sites. So most of them would be well above 20 units in total. So I think the number of projects that you would be exempting or allowing to pay a fee instead of actually building would be relatively small in the overall total.
And then who would manage the fund? How would we do that?
We would put it into the housing fund of the city.
We already have
The
a
city
housing
would we already have a housing fund, and the city would utilize those for affordable housing projects.
What determines the fee?
A nexus study, which is in the works.
Okay, so that's undetermined right now. Okay.
Yeah. We have an existing affordable housing in lieu fee in the preserve that was implemented shortly after the preserve was annexed to the city. That was based on a nexus study at that time. And so the current fee is a little over $4 a square foot, and it's assessed at building permit issuance.
Okay. Any comments on item number 4 before we move to number 5?
Two questions, like what you just mentioned, Nick, you know, with the in lieu fee down there in the preserve, have we used any of that money to actually build and use the money to build affordable housing?
So we have utilized the money for some of our other programs. So for our homelessness prevention, we have grants for that. We also utilize it for providing the caseworker services for homelessness. We do have a cap by state law. We can't spend over that cap on that. And then it also goes into our general amount to do grants and loans for older homes in the downtown. And so we've been utilizing that money, but we actually haven't utilized to build any project yet. Staff has worked with Jamboree and Bridge Housing. The city gave $10 million to Bridge Housing to build the IV 1 and 2 in College Park. And we are in
That
continuous.
wasn't housing, that didn't come from housing funds? That 10 million?
It did come from housing funds,
Okay.
yes. And so we're looking for other development partners. The biggest obstacle is land. So one of the ideas behind the inclusionary is it really forces that issue to the front. The developer has to somehow subsidize or write down these units to provide those affordable units. Or there's the option of doing the land dedication. And if they dedicate land to the city, then the city has control of that, and then we can go and work with Jamboree or Bridge Housing or somebody like that to actually build an affordable project. Because the land is usually the toughest component for the affordable housing developer.
The only way you would get land is if it's a really big project.
Right.
Okay. Any other questions on number 4? Okay, number 5, development review process. Should the Planning Commission be the decision maker responsible for site approval for affordable housing and mixed-use projects in the overlay districts, with staff-level review and ministerial approvals only when required by state law for certain qualifying projects? If the Planning Commission is not the decision maker, then to me, it would be free-for-all. A developer could propose anything, anywhere, and there would be no review process?
I think
Well, there would be a staff-level review process. So we would have a pretty extensive checklist of items that the development would need to meet. We're required to do that by state law. We're required to have a list of objective standards. The state more and more is limiting cities' ability to have subjective review of development projects in order to facilitate the creation of more housing and the ease of building. And so we have a checklist. We would refine it more, and then it would be a staff level review. The option that we're proposing is that we would take it to the Planning Commission. In a site approval, we would do design review at the Planning Commission level, and the Planning Commission would make findings. What it would be based on those objective standards. It could not be based on any subjective standard, like I don't really like this project, or I don't know, the neighbors don't like it, so I don't think I can support it. We'd have to base it on the facts.
Okay. Personally, I think we need official review to keep us all out of hot water, so to speak. You put it all on staff, and if something goes sideways, then electeds are going to be blamed, commissions are going to be blamed, and the staff's going to be hung by their toes. So I think we still need, for me personally, we need a review process. Comments?
I like the review process too, Mayor, even if there are restrictions as to what we should or can or do approve or whatever has been stated this evening by the mandates imposed on us by the state. I think also it gives us an opportunity to get the project in public view and have public comment about it, not just, a check and balance with the staff, which is what this, the governing council is designed for. I do recognize that staff would probably appreciate that because it would help with streamlining some things. I also think that when these projects come, particularly into infill projects, that there are residents or local businesses that have concern about it and people want to have public comment about it.
I agree. Okay, let's go back, start with number 1. Any council comments on the regulatory structure? Karen?
Kurt, passing. Oh, Kurt. Go ahead, Kurt.
Go ahead.
The regulatory structure, so we make it voluntary. What I've heard in this presentation is that the builder doesn't have to build to the density requiring low-income housing, right? But we would do something different either with the in lieu fee option or something else. So I think I'm a bit confused about that. If it's voluntary, then they don't have to build low-income housing, right? If it's not voluntary, then we're going to require them based off the rubric you provided to build a percentage of it low income. Is that correct?
I think voluntary means it, a property owner is still allowed to develop as permitted under the base zoning.
Okay.
However, they have the option to choose to use the overlays and to get additional density through that.
So they have the option to use the overlay. Now, is so that's the portion we're talking about. They can either use the pre-zoned or the overlay. And then the other portion that kicks in for the housing requirement on the density with the builder. Is that correct?
Yes. With the
Okay.
density has is
So
the sliding
in that
scale.
case, I think, for me, yes, I think it should be voluntary. I think the person should be allowed to build to their preferred density, or if they opt to use the overlay, I think that's, I think that's part of what we put Measure Y out there for. We told people that they would be allowed to maintain the original zoning, but the current zoning, but if they opted to use the overlay, that we were going to, I think that was part how we represented that in Measure Y. That's just my perspective on that.
It was, they have the option.
Yes, so I think yes, it should be voluntary. We shouldn't impose it on people to do it differently.
Okay, let's finish that thought.
Is that,
Any,
am I stating that correctly?
yeah, I think
Okay.
you are. Yeah, and that's how we did sell it.
Right,
You
we
still
did.
have your underlying zoning.
You have your underlying zoning, you could build to that.
Go to the the overlay if you choose to.
We were preserving the original zoning because of the state mandate.
Well, and just to get the option to the landowner.
Correct.
Kurt?
I don't, you're answering my questions as we're having the discussion. I agree with what you're saying, the voluntary aspect of that. Sorry about that. this is something that needs to be voluntary at this point in time because of the way the state's mandating us to operate. So I would agree with that.
Okay, any objections to allowing the structure to still stay voluntary?
No objections.
Okay, I agree with that as well. I think it should be voluntary. Okay, the second item was density. Structured with the maximum, I still have a problem with that maximum base density for allowances with additional density. Comments on that? No comments, Karen?
The maximum base density is
30.
30 units, dwelling units per acre, right?
It would be 20.
20.
20.
So
20.
basically, maximum base or up to
Up to? Okay.
20 dwelling units per acre to start. However, if you want to go above, if you want to go more than 20 dwelling units per acre, you need to provide a higher percentage of affordable units. In
No,
other
that's-
words, make a bigger contribution towards RENA obligations.
That's the portion I'm missing here. I agree with the 20 maximum base density with additional affordable housing. I agree with that as set forth in the general plan. I do agree with that.
Okay, any objections to that?
So on that, for the 20, if they decide, I'm gonna build 20, some of those still have to be affordable. Unless they pay an in-lieu fee.
Correct. However, I think what we decided is that in lieu fee option payment would only be for the smaller projects of less than 20 dwelling units per acre, or 20 units
Okay.
total.
No, I agree with that.
Chris? Turn on your mic.
Yeah, I have no objection to that. Yeah.
Okay, so we're clear on number 2. Number 3, development incentives. This dealt with reduced setbacks, reduced open space, reduced parking, and relief from covered parking. We got the relief from covered parking cleaned up, okay? None of us object to that. Now let's discuss the setbacks, open space, and reduced parking. Kurt?
As we discussed a few moments ago, the reduced parking is, I don't think is reasonable at this point in time, the way it's set up. I don't agree with that. I think we need to go back and revisit that and figure something else out. You know, the covered parking, we talked about, and eliminating that with the possibility of putting the solar panels up. I'm okay with that as well. That's my take on the parking issue.
Open space
Yeah, we need more. We need the open space.
and setbacks?
I'm not sure on that.
Okay, Karen?
We need the open space. I think the more density that these developments get, and even if that comes in a form of just common sitting areas and different things inside of there where people can just get out of their apartments or their areas for a period of time. Even just during the last couple of years, I think people who are living in very dense areas appreciate just being able to get out to a spot and sit. One of the things, even in my small neighborhoods, we wish we had just a small area to sit and have a cup of coffee or at a table or something. So I'm not a fan of that. I'm not a fan of not preserving some of our setbacks. I'm okay with the covered parking. Some of these things, I can't see how some of this is going to look, which is some of my questions here. For me, we talk about, hey, you said that there's other communities that have been successful in doing some of these things. Can you guys give me an example of another community near us or a project that I'm familiar with what that looks like, and so I can get my mind around how that would look in my own community?
I don't have any off the top of my head, but can I take an action item and get back to you with some
Sure.
examples?
Yeah, I mean, because you're saying, hey, other communities have been so successful with this. Okay, well, who? Because I keep hearing we're not going to need parking, or as much parking, and I challenge somebody to show me, from Montebello, where I used to live, where there was only 1 or 2 cars parked there, and as that zoning changed, it's just it's a never-ending sea of cars and people battling for parking all the time. So I don't see that working any place west of me, presently, and that's why I'm asking about these other communities that it said projects. Okay, so for me, that's, the compromise there for me, Mayor, was the covered parking.
Mark?
That's the only one I'd compromise on is the covered parking.
Okay, Chris?
I have a question. When we talk about affordable housing, are we talking about affordable like rentals, affordable ownership, or both?
I think we're talking about both. However, in reality, it's likely going to be mostly rental,
Mostly
but both are possible.
Okay. So answering number 3, I'd say I'm not a fan of reduced setbacks, not a fan of reduced open space requirements, not a fan of reduced parking, and I'm okay with the relief from covered parking requirements.
Okay. I'm going to be a little...
Madam Mayor, if I could get a clarification on the open space. So right now, the city's ordinance has a pretty high percentage of land area dedicated to open space. Would the council be amenable to an option if the land area percentage was reduced, but the quality of the amenities was increased? So therefore, maybe it's not 40% dedicated, but it's 30% dedicated, but instead of just like an open grass area in a tot lot, we might be able to require a swimming pool or something like that. So even if the land area goes down, the level of amenity goes up.
I think that would be real hard to decide right now without seeing some examples.
Sure.
But what I was going to say is I'm not necessarily against reduced setbacks if the trade-off is to keep the open space. I'm also, and this is going to be really out of my lane, but I also would not object to going to 4 stories if it's cluster built so that the open space is preserved and maybe even increased. I would rather go up and have more open space and quality of life that people could get down to rather than 3 stories and have less open space, if that makes sense. I've seen some developments now going up in Ranch Cucamonga and Ontario where they've gone 4 stories. I don't know if that has allowed them more open space or not, but it seems to be the trend. For me, it would depend on what it's next to. If it's next to industrial, commercial, you know, that kind of thing where you're not imposing that height on neighborhoods that are next to you, you know, where I'm thinking like Chino Hills Parkway down there by Ramona, where we've looked at zoning some of this. I can see where you could possibly go higher and increase a quality of life in an open space that kids could actually use, if that makes sense. And I never thought I would be in favor of a 4-story building, but I can see where there could be a trade-off if you can keep quality involved.
So Mayor, now that you bring that up, I have seen some of those developments too. If you couch it that way, I do like that as well. If the setback were to preserve quality of life to the what I would call the community areas. And Nick, I do like the idea. If we have a really high standard right now for open space, but we were to lower it and put better amenities in there, I think that attracts longer-term renters, people who are going to use that open space in their area versus having to go even walk a half a mile to get it. The chances are that they'll use that open space first, then go to another location. So if that's the trade-off where we get a better project that way, I like what the mayor just suggested, and I have seen of those. It almost feels like they call some of them almost rental resort-style living is what
Yeah,
I've seen.
right.
And that's very popular among the next generation of people who want to rent. They're not sure where they want to buy a house yet. Some of those developments that they're building are actually nice.
Well, and I'm thinking if you go up, you might be able to increase the density and get the affordable units in there and have a quality of life. It just breaks my heart to think we're forcing low and moderate income into pack and stacks with no quality of life in there. Just, okay, they've got a place to live, but there's nowhere for the kids to ride bikes. There's nowhere to throw a ball.
And they can't park.
And they can't park. It's just, to me, it just makes no sense. And I think, if anything, there's no balance. And if anything, you're actually impacting their quality of life in a negative way. They might have a roof over their head, but it may backfire in other areas. Mark, comment? No? Chris?
I just have a question. What does that look like on paper? Like what, you know, if that's something, let's just say the council wants 4 stories. I mean, is that something that, you know, we, like, how does that look like on paper for the developers? Is that, you know, is that, hey, this is the requirement, you know, 4 stories go up and not, you know, like, what does that look like on
Wouldn't be a
paper?
requirement, it would be an option.
So
Right, it would be standards. If you, if lot placement is in this, like, or building placement is clustered, then under this, clustered to a certain standard, then you could have an extra floor of height, for example. The standard would be written in
But
that
the
way.
offset would be the open and the amenities
Right.
that you would get in exchange for going up.
Right, right.
So, I mean, in that option, would the option be 4 stories and no affordable housing?
No, it would still,
Have affordable.
yeah, the affordability is a separate requirement. That's a
Right, right,
given. What
right.
we're talking about is how, what the form of the building. So the standards would talk about what the buildings look like. And if the buildings are clustered in order to provide more open space, then in exchange for that give from the developer, the developer gets an extra floor of height, for example, extra story of height.
So, okay, now,
It could be written that way.
yeah, I understand, and I maybe I'm not thinking about this right, but when we talked about the in lieu fee option, right, what we mentioned was for smaller projects, right, we can provide that in lieu fee option. Now, if a project is proposed and it's 4 stories and it falls within, right, the small project, and I know one thing we mentioned earlier was in those small projects, the reason why they're paying this in fee option is so they don't have to build the affordable. So would there be a project, or can a project be proposed where it is 4 stories? Now this developer is paying the fee, and the project isn't getting any affordable housing. Does that make
I wouldn't
sense?
think so, and like a half an acre, you would have no way to have increased
Right.
open space. So there'd be no incentive or reason to go up.
Yeah,
me.
I don't think it could really work, just because the projects that would be eligible to pay the fee are so small. 15-unit building wouldn't go up 4 stories. That would just be like a tower, like a lighthouse or something.
It'd be horrible.
Yeah.
Understand. Okay.
Any other comments on number 3? That was still 3, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, 3. Okay, number 4, in lieu fee option. I think we've almost talked that to death. It seems like the council would support small development in lieu fee.
I agree.
Not large, correct?
Correct,
Okay.
for me.
Number 5, development review process. It sounded like we all agree also that it still needs to go to the Planning Commission. Okay?
Yeah.
Any other comments on these items? Okay, any questions from you guys? You look shocked, Nick.
No.
Oh, no, I'm not shocked. I'm very happy for the thorough direction, because now we're going to be able to go back and craft something that's aligned with the council's values. So
Okay, now it'll come back to us, right?
it's going to go to the Planning Commission first. Planning Commission is required to weigh in on any zoning ordinance amendments, and then it will be presented to, and that will be a public hearing. So before it goes to the Planning Commission, a draft of these standards will be out for public review, and so we're going to take public comment on them. We're going to go to the Planning Commission, we're going to report on that public comment. Planning Commission's going to weigh in, or there may be revisions to the ordinance, and then we're going to bring a revised ordinance to the City Council for approval.
Okay. I just have a question, because we've come up with some pretty unique ideas. Can the council at least get a preview of the Planning Commission packet in case there's something that we faint about before it goes to the Planning Commission, so that you know? That's allowed,
It's
right?
just emailed to the council.
Yeah.
I don't see any issue with that at all.
Okay.
Could I ask for one clarification on the last point? It says, should the planning commission be the decision maker? The point is that it would not, these projects would not come to the council. The council's okay with that?
They don't go to.
I am. I'm comfortable with that. Because I think we are going to have some circumstances where our citizenry are going to be against everything. And we're kind of caught over a barrel with mandates from the state that even if there is a gigantic public outcry, I don't know if we're going to be able to deny something. And I don't know if bringing it to the council and receiving threats and stuff is going to change what we have to do.
Well, and the council would be the appeal body.
Right.
So if something happened in the planning commission meeting, people are always able to
Still
appeal the
comes to the
planning
council,
commission
right.
to the council.
It would be like any other development that goes through the
It
commission.
it would be like any other site approval.
Right.
It's just that the planning commissions, per state law, the planning commission's evaluation is limited to just those items that are the objective standards that the
Okay.
city has adopted.
I'm okay with that.
Okay.
Yes, thank you, Mayor and council members. I'd like to introduce Mike Carew, our Deputy Director of Development Services, who also manages our Code Enforcement Division, who will give the council an update on some statistics after the expansion of the city's code enforcement program. And then Matt Silver, our city prosecutor, who will give the council a presentation about the city's code enforcement compliance process.
Okay, thank you very much. Gentlemen?
Thank you, Nick. Good evening, Mayor and City Council. That is definitely going to be a tough act to follow, so we are going to be aware of your time and do our best to get through the presentation. But please, if there's any questions, during or after, just let us know, and we can try to address them. But part of the workshop, I think, is going to be kind of a continuation of a workshop that we had in November 2nd, 2021, which the City Council gave us clear direction on what their expectations of the code enforcement program should look like. So we took those recommendations for approval or to the council on November 16th, 2021, and they were approved. So with that, we'll kind of continue on and kind of talk about what that means and the staffing and everything else. So some of the things that we will be covering is some of the staff updates. We got some case data that we'd like to share with you, some numbers and just different types of cases that we've been dealing with. With the additional staff, we have now some code enforcement areas and new sectors. So with more sectors, that means the individual officers can spend more time with individual people, individual property owners, and kind of get real familiar with their areas. We'll touch on the kind of what is code enforcement in Chino, the purpose, why it's important, some common issues, and then the process. So real quick, you can look at the comparison. 2019, 2020, that was prior to the workshop and then the council meeting. We had 4 full-time officers, 1 part-time, which primarily worked on the weekends. We generated a little over 3,400 cases, and we have 1 full-time office assistant, which assists people at the counter, answers phones, and kind of responds to the email complaints. Since then, after we received direction and approval from the council, we hired 2 additional full-time officers. We have 2 part-time officers, so that gives us 2 officers full-time, 8 hours, on Saturdays and Sundays. So we have full weekend enforcement. The two people is very helpful, especially when somebody needs to take some time off, or if they're not able to come to work for various reasons. We'll have a minimum of at least 1, but we've been very, very good with 2. And then you can see the caseload is increased. That number will continue to increase because, as you know, it took some time to hire the staff, get the staff trained. So that number is going to be better, going to get bigger and better, and the activity is going to get higher. And we have the 1 full-time office assistant that is still working with the public, working with internal and external customers. So real quick comparison again. So we had the number of cases, as noted, 19 and 20, and then just the various types of violations. The majority of our time is spent in the property maintenance areas, but we cover all kinds of different types of violations: business license, sign violations, building code violations, general municipal code, RV, inoperable vehicles, water violations, and anything else that kind of gets thrown at us. Then you can see the comparison, the numbers have gone up to just over 5,200 cases for the year of 2021. But obviously, we still have the same types of violations. Property maintenance still taking the lead as far as where our activity is focused. So like I said earlier, the code enforcement, with the additional officers that we picked up, we are able to kind of break down the city into now 5 sectors. This is very helpful. The code officers will now become more familiar with their residents, with their needs, public outreach, just communication with them, and just become familiar with their sectors overall. So we're able to spend more time with the residents and people that need our assistance. So what is code enforcement in Chino? And kind of we'll talk about the purpose, the duties, the responsibilities, and maybe some different scenarios. So a code officer, so they're, as you know, but they're not sworn. They're civil servants. We're not police. We're not peace officers. And we come from a wide variety of backgrounds. Some people have some building knowledge. Some people have come from other agencies like the Humane. So we just have different skill sets and different knowledge that we kind of put together a team. Our duties are extremely wide in range. We always kind of joke that if somebody doesn't know where to go, they give it to code, and then we either handle it or we head them in the right direction. And I will focus on this next bullet over and over and over. Our primary goal is compliance. Our primary goal is compliance. We don't want to punish. We don't want to administer administrative citations. We don't want to take people to court. We want them to comply. And voluntary compliance is really our #1 goal. But people need to be persuaded. We do have some administrative tools, and there's different options that we can do to hopefully encourage them towards compliance. So the general purpose. So we all want a beautiful place to live, play. We want the businesses to thrive. We want everyone to feel safe. So we want to promote and maintain, create safe and healthy, desirable working environments. Just ensure compliance with the city's municipal codes and state laws. So in short, we want to protect and improve the community.
Okay, and I'll continue from there. Again, my name is Matt Silver, for those who don't know. Mayor, members of the City Council, members of the community, thank you for allowing me to serve this community. It's an honor to present this to you. To talk a little bit more about the purpose of code enforcement and why it's important, I think we have to ask, why do we care? Well, there's a couple reasons for that. One is it's the law. And I wouldn't be a lawyer if I didn't share with you a little bit of the law on that. So these are quotes right from state law. A county or city may make and enforce within its limits all local police, sanitary, and other ordinances and regulations that are not in conflict with general laws. And then secondly, we have a statutory responsibility for code enforcement. So this is not an area where cities are well advised, I think, as a practical matter, or can legally just kind of not do it. It's obviously something that's important to communities enough that it's built into the California Constitution and built into our state housing laws, both of those citations I provide for you there. In code enforcement cases, it also bears noting, they almost always start from a neighbor complaint. Staff doesn't drive around looking for violations. We're not looking to generate violations. As you could see from the data that Mike showed a minute ago, each staff member has almost 1,000 cases on their desk. And as we'll talk about in a minute, there's a pretty long process involved with these. There's an incredible amount of due process that our residents are afforded if they're the subject of a code case. So they just simply don't have the time, nor do I, to find violations. Instead, they always generate from complaints by neighbors or tenants, sometimes business owners who don't appreciate non-compliant businesses, which give them a business advantage over someone else. That's unfair. But that being said, staff in the city will not turn a blind eye to violations if they're driving around town and see something that is a health and safety risk. Reason number two that we care or should care about code enforcement is that it's about saving lives, health, and costs to the public. Ben Franklin said a lot of things really well, but one of them is worth quoting here: an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I think that applies in our code enforcement world. Certainly, Ben didn't have that in mind at the time, but it applies equally now. Code enforcement simply ensures that everyone in our community participates in and benefits from their ounce of prevention. It's easier to prevent buildings from collapsing than it is to deal with the tragedy that ensues, like the Ghost Ship fire, unfortunately, in Oakland, which killed a lot of people. There's no coming back from that for those families. So code enforcement is about preventing these kind of dangers, and that's why we have these laws in the first place. It's also about preventing disasters, illnesses, and it's far less costly in terms of lives, which at the end of the day is really what matters, but also health, happiness, and economics, and responding to them. Number three, it's about protecting and improving health and safety, preventing and protecting people against unhealthy conditions. Gosh, that really has taken a new importance in the last couple of years with COVID. And I'll also note that code enforcement officers were still inspecting and working during COVID. It's a tremendous job hazard to be a code enforcement officer. You really put yourself out there for your community every day. Substandard housing, aging housing stock. We have a shortage of housing supply, as is no secret in California. And unfortunately, a good amount of our housing in California is substandard. So people in California, I read one report that said up to 2 million people in our state are living in unhealthy, undignified, unsafe conditions. That is just unacceptable. It's also about dealing with dangerous conditions, attractive nuisances. These are the kind of things, for example, that maybe draw children, curious kids, into backyards to look at pools that are green, or into houses that are abandoned, which seems fun to a kid, but is really, really dangerous for children. Code enforcement deals with illegal drug, gang, and other criminal houses, so flop houses, places that people don't want to live next to, understandably, because it draws crime to their neighborhood. It protects against the spread of disease, rodent and bug infestations, and proliferation of these things, fire hazards, building failures, basically everything that deals with quality of life in a community. And obviously there are a lot of concerns out there, which we saw the number of reports that we get, over 5,000 from our community. Health and safety fundamentally is the bedrock of a functional community. We cannot have an unhealthy, unsafe community and be a functional community. This is nothing new. I won't belabor this, but I give you the citation to back up everything I'm saying. This isn't my opinion. This is backed up by hundreds of years of studies dating back to the 1800s. But substandard housing is associated with a whole host of problems, primarily among kids, the elderly, and the disabled. Infectious diseases, chronic illnesses, developmental and nutritional deficits, mental health problems, and of course an increase in crime. Housing is a major code enforcement duty. It's not the only duty that code enforcement has, but I reflect on it because everybody lives somewhere. Our last presentation focused a lot on that, and I thought the council did a nice job of highlighting some of the considerations about housing, but everybody has to live somewhere. So this affects people at a truly fundamental level in our society. But we have this aging housing stock, and we have a housing shortage, and we have a huge number of substandard homes in our country. Chino, unfortunately, like other cities, is not immune from that problem. Other purposes are to resolve community complaints. Again, every violation, every case starts from a community complaint in some regard. I'll put an asterisk next to that, and I'll share that in very limited circumstances, sometimes the police will get a call about maybe an abandoned property that's been broken into, which is almost always happens with abandoned or boarded up properties, and they'll call out code enforcement because when people squat or trespass in these places, they start fires. You'll see the pictures in a minute here. They do all sorts of pretty bad and dangerous things. But otherwise, I'd say 99% of them are initiated by complaints from our community. The goal is also to stop additional blight, the city slipping into additional blight. That's the broken windows theory. And of course, encourage and improve development in the city. People don't want to build in a city, generally from my experience, when they don't feel like the city is taking care of itself. All right, and we want to improve and preserve our character that people move here for, and we want to give meaning to the city's laws. They're just words on paper if they're not actually enforced. And we want to preserve the property values. That leads, of course, to a healthy general fund, which then helps the city fund things like parks and everything else that it does. And last, the broken windows theory is just worth citing here. I've got to give credit to the Criminal Justice Institute, which came up with this neat icon here. But basically, the long and short of it is that a broken window leads to someone maybe saying, well, I don't need to mow my lawn, and then I don't need to paint my house. And then people move into the community who think no one's watching, and then crime proliferates. It's really a downward trend. Code enforcement's job is to act as the line against that. It's to turn around the broken windows theory into functioning and protect functioning communities. Some just very quick examples are listed here. It's a huge swath of issues that code enforcement deals with. I called code enforcement the Swiss Army tool of cities because they really do deal with just about every issue, especially in a day and age we live in where the focus is on administrative and civil enforcement, not criminal enforcement. And we enforce here in Chino civilly and administratively. Code enforcement, their authority and duties come from just a couple sources: state law, the municipal code, and our Constitution. So there's a variety of sources that we have to follow.
So we will talk about the general functions of code enforcement and their duties. So there's a lot of codes. There's a lot of areas that we have to reference. There's a lot of areas that we kind of look at when doing so. But most of our, as Matt noted earlier, most of our complaints, most of our workload, if you will, comes from the residents, from the public. And so we respond to these complaints from the community. So every time we receive some type of complaint, there is a level of investigation. Sometimes it's just at the counter level, at the staff level, they can talk through or talk with the individual and let them know, yes, this sounds like a violation. We'll send a code officer out there and check it out. Or maybe it's not a violation. Maybe there's something else that we can do for this individual. And truly, to be honest with you, sometimes it's just somebody needs somebody to talk to, and we'll do that too. We'll listen to their concerns, and we'll address anything we can. But sometimes people just want to share maybe an experience. So we'll investigate the complaints. We'll work with the property owners and the tenants to kind of to cure any type of violations if confirmed. Some people don't even know that there is rules or regulations that they're breaking. Some people don't know about the RV ordinances or maybe some sign things like that. Some things that are maybe unique to the city that maybe are not so obvious. So we kind of educate them and work with them and kind of explain to them why we have these laws. And then we'll issue a notice. Basically, it's just it's formal, but it's not. There's no threatening. There's no citation money. There's no fines. There's nothing really tied to it. It's just to notify somebody that you're in violation. Gives them the code sections. Gives them remedies. Gives them options to how to correct the situation. Once again, we try to educate people. We'll explain them. We'll show them pictures. We'll meet with them. We'll give them the code itself, any kind of background, anything we can do to try to help them out. And we assist with the compliance. Now, we don't physically go out there and paint houses. We don't mow yards. But we work with groups. We work with nonprofit groups, church groups. We have different ways. We have a housing program. We have a lot of people in the community that want to help. Sometimes people just need a dumpster, so we can provide assistance with that. So there's different ways that we can help individuals to attain compliance. One of the other things too, because like I said, we receive these complaints, and so that responding party wants to know what we're doing. Why is it taking so long? So we try to keep people under some kind of a reasonable time frame. And we want to work with them. Everybody has their own concerns, their issues. Everybody's got something going on. So we try to work with them depending on the severity of the complaint. But like I said, we try to enforce the law as best we can through education and things like that. We also have other tools in our toolbox that we can use if people need a little bit more encouragement, if people need a little bit more of a nudge, or if we're just to kind of prove to them that the city is serious about their community and we want to keep it looking good. So the general functions of code enforcement, where does it start? Well, like we've been talking about, most of our code cases come from complaints from the residents, from the tenants, from business owners, things like that. So although it's not a legal requirement, but that's where they come from. But in saying that, if we're going to address a complaint, maybe something minor, like somebody leaving their trash cans out on the street way past their time, we drive down the street, we're not going to pass down 15 houses that have the same violation and not address those. So we'll kind of look at and kind of sweep the area for maybe similar types of violations.
Another function of code enforcement, if not the prime function, is preventing tragedies, preventing disasters. I think sometimes people think it won't happen in my community. These things don't happen. They happen all the time, unfortunately. This is obviously a pretty drastic example here in Seaside, Florida. You probably remember this. It's only a year and a half ago. A lot of people died. A lot of families really destroyed in that scenario. That came down to building code violations. These are the very things that we deal with here in Chino as well. Another issue is like a balcony collapse in Berkeley. Smaller scale issue, more building and property maintenance violations. If a city says, well, we're just going to turn a blind eye to that, these kind of things happen. This is the Ghost Ship fire. I think 30-something valuable lives were lost because of this. People living in a warehouse, and of course there's graffiti, all sorts of things going on. Real big problem.
So we're going to kind of take a look at kind of the inside scoop on code, maybe kind of what it looks like as a code officer. We'll kind of go into their world, if you will, and kind of explain kind of a step-by-step process if we can. So here we go. So part one, kind of a day in the life of. Like we said, we receive complaints. Generally, that's how the workload is created, that complaints come in any form that people would like to submit them. People come in, people make a phone call, we receive letters, I received Post-it notes, emails, any type of communication that gives us some basic information, we'll open up a case and we'll do an investigation. You can kind of see the numbers that we've talked about. Every complaint we get will receive some type of inspection, whether that be just an investigation over the phone or a full investigation out in the field, but we address everything that we receive. So you can kind of look at the numbers again, as far as the number of cases that we've opened and the number of cases that we resolved. Some cases are very easy to resolve. Maybe just, like I said, just notifying an individual that, this is the trash day and your cans need to be in by noon the next day, or you can't have your RV parked in the front yard for, more than 72 hours, or maybe some simple things that we can just kind of educate them on. So back to what we do and how we do it. So every time we receive a complaint and we determine that there's a violation, we'll reach out, speak with the property owner, the tenants, and we'll issue a notice. And the notice of violation is just that. It's just notifying, putting them on notice, like, hey, we received a complaint. We have identified a problem. Here's the municipal code section, and here's the ways to correct the violation. But I just want to make it clear, it's not on the slides. When we receive complaints, and sometimes we have the reporting party's information and sometimes we don't, but we never share that information with anybody. So, and about half the time, we'll issue a second notice. Again, this is not a citation. This is just saying, hey, we gave you 30 days. We noticed the violation still exists. Is there a question? Is there a problem? Here's another notice. Maybe we'll give you a little more time. Is there a situation? We'll kind of take a look at it. And even at sometimes we'll do kind of a final, like, hey, we're super serious now. We got to take care of this. People are concerned about the looks of the neighborhood, and we'll send like a final notice. And if that doesn't work, then we go to administrative citations, and then we start issuing administrative citations. Those fines can be pretty healthy. They start to accumulate. They start to double. They get very expensive, and generally this kind of takes care of or gets people's attention, saying, hey, the city's serious about the appearance. So then on the slide it shows less than 10% go to the prosecuting attorney. That number is definitely less than 10%. It's probably closer to 1 or even less percent that goes.
And I'll just add very briefly that you'll notice the amount of notices diminish. There's 10 out of 10 times the first contact is going to be this warning notice, this notice of violation. But about half the time, people comply. So therefore, only about 50% of the time does the city have to give a second notice. About 80% of the time after that, people comply. And so you then, only in about 20% does the city have to proceed to citations. And then 99%, it's actually, we ran the math, 0.2% of all cases come to my office. So that means 99.98% of people voluntarily comply at some point before that. By the time it comes to my desk, it's really just two groups of folks. It's either folks who just simply will not comply, they just refuse to comply and follow the law, or orphan properties. That's where maybe someone has passed away and there's not an heir who's around or wants to take care of the property. That's pretty rare.
So we'll kind of continue, as I said, the kind of day in the life of. So like I said, we normally get our complaints from the community. And so once we receive the complaint, so we'll speak with the reporting party. We'll kind of listen to their concerns. We'll take as much information as we can. And like I said, we'll take it in any format they want to give us. I mean, like I said, we've received letters, we'll get emails, and on the phone, we'll get notes at the counter. We'll get, somebody will speak to us in the parking lot. You know, we'll take all the information at any time, any place, to kind of, to get the case rolling. So once we get that, we'll start to perform our inspections. We'll take a look at it. We'll try to educate people. And we'll kind of make the decision whether there's really a violation or maybe it's just something that's just a good idea but not really a violation, and we'll make that decision, and we'll let everybody know. So like I said, we start issuing the notices. We have correction notices. We work with the property owners. We want to educate them. We'll work with other departments. We'll provide some kind of deadlines, but ultimately we want to just achieve compliance. So once the code officer has issued a warning, the officer usually checks back and verifies compliance. Most of the time this works, or maybe they'll call us and say, hey, we understand something has come up in my family. I need additional time. Can I have 10 more days, 5 more days, or some kind of extension? We work with them. You know, as long as the violation is not really a life safety issue, general property maintenance, we're going to work with the people. We're going to work with the public to try to get voluntary compliance. So as we kind of exhausted that, maybe the reporting party is calling us and asking why the work hasn't been done, why my neighbor's house looks the way it does still, and all these different things. And we've issued maybe 1, 2 notices. Maybe we've done one kind of a final notice, and we told them that if we don't get compliance, then hey, this is going to be our next step. And then we start to have to issue the administrative citations. So even with that, the administrative citations, most of them will have a compliance period. So if we issue a citation, it'll say, hey, you need to comply within 15 days. In that 15 days, if the compliance or the violations have been corrected, that citation never goes anywhere. The fine is not due. It is destroyed. It is not even issued. But if they do not correct the actions and the citation has become, we process citation and they have to pay the fines, then they can appeal it. And there's different ways to appeal it. They can do it through a hearing officer, which is third party, comes in, listens to our side, listens to the violator side, and then makes the decision. And then if they uphold, the hearing officer upholds our decision, then they can appeal that to the courts.
However, if these many warnings, meetings, inspections, and notices do not result in compliance, then the city's last resort is to ask a court to enforce the law, and judges are really the last stop. They can issue orders requiring people to comply. In Chino, the city goes to court only as a last resort. Unless there's some extreme emergency, very, very dangerous situation, or it's pointless, but I don't think I've ever seen a case where it hasn't, we haven't tried other things first, nor would I really agree to proceed with one where we haven't tried other things first. It's not required by law that court's the last stop, but as a practical matter, it is, and it can be costly, and so it should be. The remedies that we ask court for are set by the state and local law. It's the city's decision whether to direct me to initiate a legal action or not. We have to give notice to the violator. We have to file motions with the judge, giving actual evidence and citing the law. And the other side gets their chance, as they should, to argue against that and give their evidence. The city carries the burden of proof. It's its case. If it chooses to file, it has the burden to show that these violations exist. But at the end of the day, the goal is compliance. It's always compliance, not punishment. Depending on the nature of the violation of the case, the court may issue an order telling the violator to fix the problem, or in housing cases, the law provides for a receiver, which is basically a person who works for the judge, to do what the owner didn't do: get permits, hire contractors, get the property in compliance. Obviously, the judge can't do that, and the city doesn't have the money to hire contractors for everybody's properties who fall foul of the law. But the vast majority of cases are resolved without need for court. In fact, even when cases come to me, very few of them I actually have to file for court. I do everything I can to avoid going to court. But sometimes, unfortunately, it's necessary. Quick note on receivers. I know that's been a point of interest sometimes. A receiver works for the judge, not the city, not me, not the property owner. The receiver's job is just to do what the owner didn't do: hire someone and correct the violations. The receiver can only do what the judge authorizes the receiver to do. It's really all up to the judge at that point. Whether the property is rebuilt, rehabbed, or demoed is determined by the receiver and the judge based on what's the most economical thing to do. Demo is not a preferred option, but sometimes the conditions are so bad that it would be too costly to rebuild the property. And sometimes the zoning doesn't allow it anymore because zoning's changed since maybe old housing has been built. But the receiver takes possession of the property to get it fixed up. It doesn't take ownership, nor does the city, nor do I. Nobody owns the property in a receivership except for the property owner. In the end, the owner can keep the property, or the judge may order it sold if the owner decides not to reimburse the receiver for the costs of fixing up their own property. I do this not to make your eyes bleed, but simply to point out that in the full scope, if a violator does not comply after all these things, it forces the city to go to court. By my count, there are 42 different steps in the process. That includes 42 steps of due process, appealing at multiple points in the case, multiple notices. Before filing a lawsuit, by my count, there are at least 14 different notices, due process steps, appeals, meetings, and inspections. That's lots of opportunities to comply for someone who wishes to comply. And then after a lawsuit, in the rare instance that has to be filed, there are several dozen more steps. So it simply is not true if someone claims they didn't have notice, or they didn't know, or they didn't have a chance. Judges have to make these decisions in cases, not us. We present the law and the facts to the judge who makes that determination based on the law. And the violator has rights at every step to contest that and present their own evidence, which they very often do. All right, I know we're running short on time, so we'll go very quickly through some success stories, really just mainly photos.
Yep, and so, as you may or may not know, code enforcement loves pictures. So, because, I mean, if you kind of look at some of these things as we'll cruise through some of these slides, we can say a lot. We can explain, we can show, we can demonstrate, but the pictures, they really just kind of speak for themselves. And these are the situations that we have in our city. All these pictures I'm about to show you are from the city of Chino. And so the things that the code staff kind of encounter every day. This was an abandoned building not too far. It's on the other side behind Carolyn Owens off 9th Street. It was built as a residential unit, became vacant. It started to deteriorate. The roof started to cave in. We had squatters. We have it was people trespassing and doing some unusual things. You can see the artwork on the side of the building. It becomes boarded, and then all of these things, it continues to just deteriorate. People break in, get through the boarded windows, and then use this as some type of activity, whatever they decide to use it for, but it's all illegal and dangerous. So this particular case, we went through the process. We went through all 42, 44, whatever the number of steps were that Matt had pointed out. It took a very long time. It was a very lengthy process. But in the end, the receiver took over, took a look at the conditions, made the determination that the best way to abate this property, to abate the violations, was to remove the illegal and damaged structures. And so now we have a property that is in compliance. This is another one we had on Bonchino Avenue, kind of near a kind of a preschool. Large property. I don't remember how many acres, but it was a very large property. Had multiple units. You can kind of see things start to grow when the one illegal addition becomes two, and it becomes, we don't even know what was permitted or not. Very substandard conditions. There's this unhealthy living conditions.
And I'm sorry, Mike, it bears repeating, there are human beings living in these units, including children.
So, and then just the site conditions that we have, like Matt talked about, you just got junk and debris, and then once it starts, it just kind of snowballs. This is very, very interesting picture. This is a one of a kind for me. This is not an equipment that used to clean up the property. This was, for whatever reason, somebody thought it was a good idea to maybe use this equipment to dig a hole and then bury the equipment. So not sure why they did that, but it was done. So then again, we had to take this one to all the way, follow all the process, all the steps. And a receiver was appointed. The receiver looked at the property, had contractors go out, and the determination was made in this case, since there was so much illegal, dilapidated construction, they recommended demolition. So now we have a vacant lot. Hopefully a builder will pick it up and we can build things. Those were two examples of residential properties. This is an area that is non-residential. This was an area down south. It became kind of a dumping ground with all kinds of interesting storage containers and just unhealthy conditions and hazardous materials. This area right here appears to be water, but it's not water. It's all kinds of interesting liquids that I don't really want to kind of go into too much depth. In this right here is an illegal dumping. These are mounds of pizza dough and just food waste and products that people thought it was a good idea to store and to spread out. Then again, the property got cleaned up, and now we have a vacant lot. Environmentalists went out there, and everything is clean. Some of the issues are a little more, they're minor, but we work at them. The broken window theory, we want to catch things before it gets too serious. This is an area that has just overgrown vegetation. A quick phone call, property owner goes out there and cleans it up. Same thing with this building right here. We notice that there's some graffiti, work with the property owner, and they get the graffiti removed. Then again, the same thing here. These are green pool issues, whether it be neglect, whether it be the house is vacant. These attract mosquitoes and things like that. It's an easy fix, but we want to head off the problem before it gets serious. This particular picture right here, the ceiling collapsed during an inspection from a code officer. So this was a first-hand witness of a ceiling leak. This one right here is an interesting one. I don't know if you can notice our friends on the right that are kind of taking residence of the house.
Those are rats.
Yeah, and so, but this house was a real mess to a point where they had to replace a lot of the framing because it was so saturated. And that house got cleaned up and that was sold. These are just kind of some examples of some of the code successes that we get into. We get into the properties, educate people, we explain them, we work with them, and to try to get things cleaned up. So.
All right, in conclusion, good, effective, efficient, fair code enforcement process. A good, effective, efficient, and fair code process protects the community, avoids lawsuits, saves lives and health, avoids tragedies, helps protect our homes and business districts in the city, and keeps things healthy. It's a priority set by City Council. We enforce laws that are adopted by the city at the direction of the city.
So, in conclusion, we follow direction from the council. So I ask of you, what kind of community do we want? What kind of community does the city council want now and in the future? Are we heading in the right direction? You want us to do anything different? We're very proud of our process. We think the process is fair, but we love to get feedback and we love to get direction if there's anything we need to do different. Thank you.
Thank you for the information. This provided some very, very interesting and thorough procedural information that I think will come in very handy in the future. Thank you very much for your presentation and the slides. Will those slides be available on our website in case the public has questions?
We could make them available on the code enforcement website, yes.
I think that would be a good idea for anyone that wants additional information or kind of wants to know what the process is.
Absolutely.
Any questions of staff? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor.
We will
you.
now call a short recess, and then our regular meeting will convene at 7 o'clock.